All right, everybody, welcome to the Software Speaker Show, a show designed to help engineers become better communicators. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing somebody who's led a very interesting life. Aubrey Kagan was born and raised in Rhodesia, which is now called Zimbabwe. He got his electrical engineering degree from the Israel Institute of Technology. Then he got his MBA from the University of let's tell me again. Witwatersrand in South Africa. And then he moved to Canada because why not? So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Aubrey Kagan, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
So I'm going to start you off with the same question I give to all my guests, which is, what made you get into engineering? Where were you? How old were you? What happened? At what point in your life did you say to yourself, that's what I want to do when I grow up?
Oh, it's very difficult. I grew up in a family that was non-technical.
Okay.
So perhaps I became an engineer in the end as a self-defense. I remember maybe age 10 or 11, the fuse blowing in the house. And I somehow managed to figure out how to do it by myself, to repair it by myself. I mean, there was the obligatory dismantling of a clock. There was the, I used to build, at the time I was growing up, they were building a dam in Rhodesia called the Kariba, which at the time was, or once it was finished, was the biggest man-made lake in the world.
Okay.
Until they built the Aswan Dam. And that, of course, seeped into all aspects of life. So I used to make a dam out the back I used to make a cement wall out of it. And
nice.
Progressed through there, somewhere in there, you know, my father owned a paper processing factory. And to him, an engineer was what we would have called today a maintenance engineer.
Right.
And he had very little idea of what engineering was, although he often thought that I should be an engineer. And in fact, wanted me to go to technical school, but my mother insisted on an academic high school. So nobody really knew what engineers did. And there weren't actually a lot of engineers around in certainly the society that we were in. Doctors, lawyers, that kind of thing, and businessmen, but no engineers. Okay. I became interested in engineering, I guess, at the end of high school. And in fact, there was a half course, it was called, in our school called electronics, which I did, which was mainly valves, but I did it anyway. And I thought I must have been moving towards engineering then. Towards the end, I was doing a lot of studying for my final exams, and I started making a lot of paper airplanes. And so I got talked into doing aeronautical engineering.
Okay.
I went to university, and somewhere between the time I went to university and the time that I started university in Israel, I changed to electronics, and I'm not sure why.
Okay. Now, that's an interesting question. How did you go from Africa to Israel?
Okay, well, the schooling in Rhodesia was very English. It was an English syllabus. It was English. The exams were marked in England. And the standard of study was much higher than the standard in South Africa. Maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead here. There was no university there was a university in Rhodesia, but it never had any engineering at it. So I had to leave, to do engineering, I had to leave the country one way or another. Right. My mother was born in Israel. Well, when she was born, it was Palestine.
Okay.
And we had a lot of contacts with it. I am a Zionist. And I should also add that the story went around that the students who went from Rhodesia to South Africa to do engineering, or almost any degree, always found it very easy because the standard was much higher in Rhodesia. We had an extra year of schooling and the British standard and so on. And the story always went that the Rhodesians sort of had a party for most of the year, and suddenly the South Africans had caught up, and by that time the Rhodesians weren't interested in working, and they ended up failing the first year. So,
oh, wow.
I decided that, and perhaps it was a challenge. I mean, the school I went to, the university I went to, is highly, well, certainly is highly regarded in the world. So perhaps I viewed it as a challenge.
Okay. So you went from aeronautical to electrical engineering some way, somehow. And then you went back to South Africa for an MBA.
Okay, so I was, the two aspects to this. I was never a great student at university, and I was convinced I wasn't a good engineer.
Interesting.
And I decided that, you know, if I wasn't going to be a good engineer, somebody has to manage engineers. So I was going to do management, and I was going to do MBA.
Okay.
In 1973 was the Yom Kippur War, which deferred everything at university.
Yeah.
And pushed it right to that was the end of third year, and I went into fourth year. Final year, and that pushed everything late by 3, 4, 5 months. So by the time the academic year meant that if I wanted to go straight into an MBA, I had to go somewhere in the Southern Hemisphere where the year starts in January.
Okay.
South Africa was never really a great favorite, but I had to go, one, because my parents were trying to get out of Rhodesia at the time, which was in the middle of a civil war. And also, as a matter of funding, because I don't know if you know the history of Rhodesia's Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. It was considered an illegal country at the time, so all the funds were frozen. There were sanctions and all this kind of thing. Wow. And you know, getting money out for education was easier if you were going to South Africa than if you were anywhere else. So wow. I ended up going back to South Africa.
You've had your share of challenges. and so you go from Israel back to South Africa, you get your MBA, and then you somehow made your way all the way up to Canada.
Well, that's I spent 13 years in South Africa. There was a bit of work there.
Oh, okay. I'm shortening it.
What happened was I was never fond of the political situation. I mean, I left Rhodesia for the political situation, or at least I never went back. And South Africa, I didn't like the politics either. So I was always leaving. And, you know, I finished university, I got married, and of course, things start getting pushed ahead further and further. But it got to the point where we decided it was now or never. And we investigated both Australia and Canada. Australia being it was much closer to the South African way of life. But they dragged their heels, and so I investigated Canada. Canadians approved me a week before the Australians approved me, and we had to make a decision.
Oh, wow.
I have a sister in Canada, and so I guess we ended up choosing Canada.
Okay. Family ties.
Yep.
Good. Well, that's amazing. I mean, you gone from pole to pole almost. So you went from being an engineer to thinking you were going to manage engineers, and
now 45 years later, whatever my proficiency is in engineering, it's much better than my proficiency in management. So I've stayed in engineering. I mean, I did try to start my own business in South Africa, and you know, on and off, I've implicitly used the engineering education, but not much of a manager.
Okay. Different strokes. So if someone were to ask you what you do now for a living, what's your answer?
I'm an electrical engineer.
Fair enough. Now, so if they press you further, because that's a pretty broad area, because I have a degree in electrical engineering, but I steered more towards, you know, hardware and embedded. Mm-hmm. But electrical engineer, that could be, you know, power systems. It could be.
Over the years, well, in short, I work in industrial electronics, in particular the interfacing of the signal generated in electronics and until it gets to something like a programmable logic controller or a computer or something. So that interface space is where I am. Okay. Involves a lot of micros, and quite a bit of signal conditioning with both analog and digital circuitry.
Okay. So you are down at the quote unquote board level thing?
Oh, yes, yes.
Analog circuitry, black magic.
Yep. I was forced into it. I always thought I was never going to know anything about analog electronics. And then I got told to do it, and I've had some degree of success, I guess. Comes from reading application notes.
You were told to do it. That's interesting. But
yeah, well, you know, I moved into, when I got to Canada, I started working. I almost moved out of real engineering and went into specification. So I was working on the Canadarm2, which is the robotic arm on the International Space Station.
Oh, okay.
And when I moved out of that, I found a job that in a company that was in the field that I mentioned, the industrial signal interfacing.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the limited resources, they had jobs that required analog design, and I was the one with the time to get into it, so okay. I ended up having to do it. Don't say that I'm a great analog signal engineer, but I've managed to do my share of designs.
Well, there you go. That's all that matters. Now, most people probably would have left it there, but you also have done some publications, some writing. How did you go from just being an engineer to an engineer who is also a communicator?
Well, I actually started technical writing much earlier than most. I did it at about the age of 11, I think.
Oh, wow.
The teacher gave us a project to write a description of how to change a flat tire. And I remember describing it, and he was most impressed that I discussed where I wrote about when you removed the nuts from the wheel, you had to put them into the hubcap so you didn't lose them, and he was most impressed by that.
Yeah, very good.
When I moved in, well, as I said, for a short time in South Africa, I actually had my own company. And through the MBA, I decided that it was right at the start of microcomputers. So I decided that I should need to educate the public, or at least business, about it. So I wrote a couple of articles about that, about some of the projects I'd done. I'd actually worked on a project for a coffee packaging machine. And it had an LVDT, which is a form of load cell, which required an analog gain to it. I, as I said, wasn't touching analog. So they got somebody else to design analog who said he was a specialist, and he designed it with 741s, but they used to drift all over the place. The voltage used to vary, the temperature, and I came up with a technique of calibrating the machine every few hours. And so I decided this was a good selling point, a good method of introducing why using microcomputers. And I wrote an article about it in a local magazine, and another article after that, and tried to develop from there. Not much happened after that until I got to Canada. Well, no, let me back up again. I tried submitting at the time. Today there's not much of it, but the magazines used to have something called Ideas for Design. Mm-hmm. So you would write a short idea and you put it in, and if you were lucky, they'd publish it, and lucky, if it was good enough, they'd publish it, and you would get $100 or something like that. So I tried from South Africa and got refused. When I got to Canada, I came up with an idea, which I submitted to, I think it was EDN, and got published and got selected as the best idea in the issue.
Oh, very nice.
After my experience from those days, it probably meant that just one person voted for it. But it got me going, and I thought I could write some more. And I subsequently wrote another 2 or 3 ideas for design, and those also got accepted.
Oh, okay.
And my supervisor at the time kept on urging me to write a proper article, should write something, and I decided that I would like to write, if I was going to write, I'd like to write about original stuff that is different. I saw no point in writing about what other people have written about. They can write much better than I can, and I wasn't going to try and stick my neck out and have somebody chop it off for being stupid. So we came up with a particular project that was particularly intriguing, even today. The company I work for makes products that measure currents from 1 amp all the way up to 100 amps.
Okay.
And when you're designing, you need something to generate that kind of current, and when you're testing, when you're manufacturing, you need to calibrate that current. 100 amps when you're working out of something is dangerous. Yes. If you've got the voltage to go with it.
Yeah.
And my supervisor knew of a particular technique where you created a toroidal transformer with just 1 or 2 turns at the output. So the voltage is very low, but because you're power in, power out, you get a much higher current out of that. And we developed the idea from there of moving away from using the mains to generate, because the mains vary over time. So I created a steady oscillating waveform, and then I had a feedback loop on it and a whole control system on it. And that I decided was worth writing about. Okay. I wrote an article for Circuit Seller, which at the time actually would produce 2 issues in a month. One was an online, which was completely different to the printed magazine. Mm-hmm. And I think because it was a little bit out of the normal approach to this stuff, they decided they'd put it in the online version, which was fine and went down okay. I then followed it up with a 3-part article on using Excel and electronics, Microsoft Excel and electronics. And that was quite well accepted. And shortly after that, I got a phone call from Elsevier Publishers, and they asked me, would I like to write a book about it? Which I did. There were a bunch of other articles after that I wrote for Circuit Seller. And then in about 2012 or so, and I'm trying to remember who answered it, but they started introducing websites, forums where you'd have, they started all the blogging type of websites. Right. So there was, and I think one of your previous interviews mentioned Microcontroller Central. And I, at the time, well, slightly before that, in fact, Max had started writing for EE Times, and he'd put out a request for memories, blogs on people's memories of the early days of computing. And so I wrote a series of 4 or 5 articles for him. And they also had a series of book reviews, which I did as well. And then there was this website, embedded Microcomputer Central.
Embedded.com.
There were already quite a number of bloggers on it. And somebody had written a blog on Modbus. I don't know if you know Modbus. Modbus is a serial communications protocol.
Yes.
And he made some assertions in his blog that I felt weren't correct. And I answered with some fairly lengthy answers to his blog, referring him to an article, in fact, that I'd written for Circuit Center on the Modbus. Okay. And so then the editor, Rich Cornell, sort of contacted me and said, wouldn't I like to write some blogs?
Okay.
I thought about it, and he said, well, how many did you want to write a month? And I thought, okay, well, I probably could do 2 a month. And then thinking that I'd overcommitted myself, I then sat down and wrote down a list of maybe 30 or 40 topics that I could write
Pretty
about.
good.
And then in the space of about, because I was always worried, I always thought that it was like a contractual agreement and who knows what would happen if I didn't supply the 2 a month. I sat down and over a period of 3 months wrote all 30 or 40 blogs.
Wow.
Which made life fairly easy for me afterwards because I had the stock that I could always, if I needed anything, I could just pull it out and send it in. And
That's nice.
Anyway, so that went on for, I mean, that website lasted for maybe a year, maybe 18 months. And then the owners of the website, I guess for financial reasons, whatever, collapsed it into, there were a whole bunch of websites around then that covered connectors. There was one called All Programmable Planet that Max had done. There was one called Planet Analog. There were ones on connectors. There were one on test instruments. And they all ended up being collapsed into, almost ended up being collapsed into EE Times. And Max was there as well. Rich Cannell suggested that I approach Max about writing for him and also for Planet Analog. And then I started writing blogs in EE Times and Planet Analog. EE Times was then split, decided that they wanted to go back to their format of just news. And so Max moved to a website called to embedded.com, which was originally Embedded Systems Programming. And had just gone onto online. So I started writing for Embedded Systems, well, embedded.com, and I was still writing for Planet Analog at the time. Then Max moved over to a website called EE Web.
Yes, I remember that.
So I was writing now for all three, Embedded, EE Web, and Planet Analog. And then the whole market the whole blogosphere collapsed for electronics. So there are things there, but you know, I haven't got much the right attitude to write for them. You know, I didn't like the way it was done. I've kind of run out of my stock of blogs, and you know, I don't really write. I should rephrase. I still write some articles for Circuit Seller. In fact, the latest was on early this year. Yeah, so, and I continue to write on and off when the mood takes me.
That's nice to be able to write whenever you want. What do you say to engineers who think that writing or communicating is only for salespeople, that they don't need to, they're smart enough as engineers, they don't need to know how to write?
Well, I have to tell you the number of examples of poor writing that I've seen from engineers is really unsettling. I recently bought a book on on one of the free CAD systems. And there must have been scores of grammatical errors, spelling mistakes, autocorrects that made no sense, not being able to quite literally not know his left from his right.
Wow.
When you say press the left button, it was the right button. You know, it's possible to write. It takes practice, as Jack Gansel was saying. It also needs people to edit what you're saying. But it can be done. And it should be done.
Okay. What would you say is the biggest benefit of you having learned how to get into that space?
I don't know that there's any professional benefit that I've got from this. A lot of people have. But I would say that what others have said, if you want to get professional benefit from it, you should be go into public speaking. I've never been one for it. So I've just got the personal satisfaction from having written a lot of stuff. There's also, at one stage, there used to be financial reward for it. So I've made a bit of money. I mean, I haven't done it for a living, but you know, I managed to eat out once in a while.
Oh, that's good. That's good enough. As you were going through this, it sounds like you just sort of learned it on your own, or did you actually take a class? Did you have a mentor?
My mentors tended to be the editors that I was writing for.
Okay.
I came out of school. I went to a very old-fashioned school. It was, you know, I went to school my high school was in the 60s where we were, but the school was established like an English private school of the 30s. Extreme discipline. Everything was drummed into you, beaten into you. And so when I got to writing, my style was a very old-fashioned style. And the editors had to correct it. I used to write in a third-person passive style, very,
okay.
Not the style of today's writing. And the editors had to correct that, which I had to learn to adapt to. So most of the changes I made in my style came from the editors.
Okay, but clearly you were fortunate enough to have them, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have to remember that when you're writing, I know some of your previous interviews have actually said that you should write for you know who you're writing for.
Right.
That's generally true, but in the stricter sense, there's a gateway before you get to your readers, and that gateway is the editor. So the editors who don't like what you say, sometimes they will give up what you say. They will say, sorry, we can't use what you're doing. And you have to kind of learn to live with some refusals. You have to have a thick enough skin, and you shouldn't give up. I mean, I can tell you some stories of articles that I've written that have been refused and then have turned around into something very successful. I was working with a company on menuing systems on one of those relatively small text-based displays.
Okay.
Character-based displays, and you know, you would enter, you'd scroll down and you said, I want option 4 or 5 or something like that, and you'd enter, and then you'd go to another set of menus, and then you would go to change a parameter or change or observe a variable or something. And so I wrote the program very linearly, and 3 or 4 months later they didn't like it, they wanted changed, and I changed it. And again, 2-3 months later, they wanted change. And I said, no, there has to be a better method of doing this. And I created an approach with using tables that would fit allow you to move from one to the other just by setting up a table. And I thought that would be a good article to write about, which I did. But it was early in my writing career, and I really didn't know. I felt very uneasy about how to present what I wanted. I was I've always been fairly disillusioned with the feedback I get from articles and blogs and stuff like that. And at the time, I was a little disillusioned with the feedback I was getting from Circuit Seller. So I thought I'd try another magazine, which was more in the software line anyway. And this was a pure software article. So I sent it away, and the editor sat on it for 6 months, something like that.
Wow.
And so I wrote an email to him, and I said, I presume that this is dead. And I should add that at this point, one thing you should know about writing for magazines is you'd never write and send it to 2 magazines, because if they both happen to accept it, you're in trouble. If they both refuse, it's not a big deal, but if they both accept it, you really don't know, and your name is going to be in mud if you try and work your way out of that. So anyway, I wrote to because I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to submit to somewhere else until I had a refusal from the editor. I wrote to him and I said, what's going on? He said, I presume it's not going anywhere. So he sent back a very curt answer saying, it's over when I say it's over, and I'll let you know. 2-3 months later, he got back saying, I don't think I can use this article. Refocus it and cut the fat.
Interesting.
Yeah, it didn't help me much. So I thought,
talking about communication.
With my tail between my legs, I went back to Circuit Center and I gave it to them. And they submitted it to one of their writers who gave me a very good critique of it. Short, but very, very, very good. And I rewrote it and I gave it to them and they published it. And I still get questions and discussions about it now, 18 years later. Another instance.
That's pretty good.
I was working on a design idea.
That's pretty successful.
Okay, it's dropping out a bit again. I was working on a design idea for, I'd seen in a data sheet a method of shifting voltages just using resistors. It was a thing that went from, if I remember correctly, it was a minus to 5 volt input and it was going to an A to D converter and it was converting it from 0 to 5 volts. But I didn't put any values in on the data sheet. And so I started working on this and I came up with, I figured I went down to first basics of Kirchhoff's laws and I figured out that you could shift almost any voltage to any voltage using resistors. And I also built an Excel worksheet to do that. So you just figured out, you just entered the voltages you wanted that were in and the voltages you want out, and it would calculate the resistors for you. And I submitted that as a design idea to one of the magazines. And I got an answer from the editor saying he was a fan of my book, but he didn't want to use this because he'd worked with analog drivers and it didn't take into account that the circuit was, that the current, you could overload the driver. So I said, what about if I put a proviso in the thing that, in the Excel worksheet that catered for that? And he said, no, he still wouldn't use it. So I submitted it to another magazine. And even today, I still get people downloading it. And again, 20 years later. So don't give up if you've got a good idea.
Wow. So there you go. That's what I was going to say. Okay. Well, it looks like we're starting to get a bit of a interruption.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you, Aubrey. Thank you for coming on and sharing all that with us. Any last bit of advice, generation?
So sorry, I didn't quite get that.
Oh, okay. I was just asking if you had any advice. One last bit of advice.
Really find yourself some mentors. Try and find original ideas to write about. It's pointless writing about something that some of the luminaries have written about because you're bound to get challenged on what you write. But keep your chin up, keep trying.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, I think we'll end it there because it's starting to get choppy. But thank you again. I appreciate you sharing all that with us.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'll stop the recording now.